on Amazon for a second. They're big enough to take some criticism. Amazon is arguably one of the most notable and wealthy corporations in the entire world. Take a look at Bezos' wealth. Plus, it basically owns the internet, the modern world for the average American. For one, they crush small businesses by spying on sellers, appropriating data, then steal the idea so Amazon can copy it, make the product cheaper, and guess where they're mass producing it? Like I said, there was once a time when imaginations were uninhibited, a time that produced an influx of ideas. If you had an idea, you could make it into a product, bring that product to the free market, and then get rich. We called that the American dream. But that was when the free market was still free. Now, we're ruled by corporate communist power, Chinese-owned, consumer-backed, guaranteed. Let's draw some parallels. 1. China has a social credit system. Reports state that this system is a combination of government and business surveillance that gives citizens a score. What sort of restrictions can come of a low score? Try not being able to buy an airplane ticket, or take out a loan, or buy property. These are just some of the big ones. Today, corporate America is adopting its own system of self-communization via the woke brigade. Ever heard of ESG? It stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. You can now find an ESG score at a corporation near you. ESG scores are completely made up of arbitrary metrics. Unlike financial reports, which are grounded in real things like earnings, revenue, and expenses, ESG scores are given based on the subjective view of various rating organizations. Organizations, mind you, that are also made up. Several different groups of Bolsheviks got together and decided to rate companies and corporations based on how well those companies are striving for the unattainable goal of diversity and environmental nirvana. And because those wokes are also the judge, jury, and executioner of the canceled trials, companies, and more importantly, investors, are actually taking ESG scores seriously. This situation looks a lot like a self-perpetuated spiral into something pretty similar to Xi's corporately communist regime. While the dictators may look different, the subjective control by way of selective enforcement of arbitrary rules sure looks similar. Think about it. Silicon Valley hated President Donald Trump. Whether or not you like him, he was the leader of the most powerful nation on the planet. And if the wokes can wipe the internet of his presence, think of what they can do to you, the little consumer turned product. 2, they'll delete you. In China, it's called disappearing someone. In America, we call it canceled, deleted. And none of us are exempt. Why do you think there's so much virtue signaling? It isn't because corporations actually believe Black Lives Matter is an upstanding organization. It's because their god is money, and if appeasing the cancel police is the best way to financial mecca, they'll bend over backwards pretending to care. And the most money comes from the Chinese hand that feeds them. 3, so they rely on censorship and subversion. Look at the NBA. It won't criticize the imprisonment of Uyghurs, but will endlessly champion Black Lives Mattering. And think of how often Hollywood makes major movies with a Chinese villain. Not often at all. But you can bet the antagonist is white and probably walks out with a lot of cash. The virtue signals are faker than the rampant systemic racism corporations espouse. Part of corporate America's brand is subversion. Social media is arguably Big Corp's biggest product that, ironically, has attempted to turn all of us into products. It also only furthers our isolation and hatred for one another. That hatred even inspired some to believe that their neighbors should be tracked and then punished accordingly.
We just ask everybody to do more, to report those who aren't doing the right thing, but also to be vigilant in making sure you're doing the right thing.
This leads me to point 4. Contact tracing during the CCP bat fever was another subtle but distinct example of segregation imposed by the tech overlords. The idea of contact tracing pissed off a lot of people, but it also soothed many of those who didn't leave their homes for 2 years. History has shown us that tracking a person's whereabouts or confining them is usually a pretty good indication of pervasive oppression. Think of every time you were required to get a COVID test, or worse, proof of vaccination. Think of every time Google asks if you'd like to use your location for more accurate search results. Think of that ad that you see online that just so happens to be a product that you had in mind. Or of the fact that your phone includes your private messages, photos, home address, social security, and search history. You think using a facial recognition app to open your Wells Fargo account is just for your convenience? We once saw how a country used a fundraising website against everyday people. They lost access to their banking. And no, I'm not talking about Hong Kong. I'm talking about the West, Canada. And this is where all this information collection in the digital age leads. We're no longer consumers whose demands determine the market. The market in the digital information era is the state. And the state rules the markets that are run by the billionaires who are as power obsessed as the government. Which means we live with the illusion of free markets just as much as Chinese citizens live with the illusion of democracy. They're never free of China's eye. We're never free of corporate America's control, so long as we're just the product and not the consumer. Consolidation of power equals a constriction of ideas. Ultimately, this creates a market that is not free. And because we're trending for the worst, it creates a market we're excluded from. Did you know that Russia agreed to provide China with gas for 30 years? Probably not. Which would mean you also didn't know the deal was done in euros. Wake up. The people who once determined the market are not free. And with where the world is going, no product is free and nobody is free. It's time to look in the mirror and ask ourselves who we even are anymore. Very powerful people think they can redefine us and control us like cattle, directing us down destructive paths that will lead to a slow death of freedom. We see this in social credits, cancellations, censorships, tracing, and division. As we talked about in the last episode, we also see the new socialism playing out in the form of inflation, shortages, and the supply chain issues. By the way, how are those gas prices working out for your wallet? While we're ending on a high note, you ever thought about wheat? Who has a monopoly on that? And what happens if they ever decide to deprive us of it? A powerful hand is one that holds all the resources. And we aren't just behind the game. We're looking at a future where we're not even in the game. For now, I digress. The rabbit hole is just a little too dark. But in our next episode, we won't hesitate to dive deeper into the supply chain in greater detail. Here's a plot twist for when you begin to think you've made it out the other side. They don't want to solve socialism. In fact, they want more of it. Guys, we've become just products, but we don't have to be.